Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Tanner. I'm just a voice, the background. I will not be your narrator. I will not be your director. I will not be any of those things because I am not the storyteller here. The man of the hour is Terry Pratchett. He authored The Discworld, many other types of books. This book that I'm holding in my hand, was, the manuscript was done in 1992. It was published in 2013. It is one of, well, I would say about 30 other books that he made. And as long as we say Terry Pratchett's name, he shall not be forgotten. This book, this this fine piece of paper is a work of fiction, and I will do my best to give it what I can, to be able to read to you and partake to you that this book, when it was originally purchased many years ago, was $9.59. It's a paperback. If we listen to it, it has a story inside, but just the smell, the feel of a book, this man is what this man, if you can see him, that's Terry Pratchett. I met him at some science fiction conventions. He was cool. He liked to dance. Yes, and he had a very good sense of humor. You can still buy these books. I get my books now, most of the time, because of no other choice, but to get them out of thrift stores and any other place I can find them. I used to sit in bookstores by myself in old bookstores covered with different books of different eras, and I could read them, open them, just read one part of them, put them back, because I really didn't have any money. When I was 14, I didn't have enough money to even buy a used book a lot of times. But I somehow managed sometimes to come by and get several books. I'd beg and then I would go do my paper route. And if I could do my paper route, I could maybe come home with some tips or some other things. You never know what would happen. But those were the days. So if I would spend $7 on a book or $5 on a book that was out of $70 that I made for the entire month of delivering papers, I thought that was well worth it. Of course, as a kid, I didn't really think about rent, things like that, but I thought about books and the stories and the people that would tell them. I did not meet Terry Pratchett till, about 10 years ago. But he used to wear this shirt that says, "You couldn't get Terry J.K. Rowling," right? And this other guy was just too expensive. So you got me, Terry Pratchett. He's just amazing that way. Anyway, not full of himself, but really an amazing author. And, you just can't get that way without writing a hell of a lot. And really good. Hogfather, other kinds of books you can read. Now, I just want you to gather yourself, picture yourself, and close your eyes, because I'm going to do the work tonight. Just for a few pages. Maybe you'll drift off to sleep. And as I custom do, I, like Hamlet's father, dream in my gardening, listening to books and audiobooks. But now, as I turn to page 1, there's this little ink thing on it. It's a little swirl. It's an illustration. Yeah? Maybe you can see it. But let us start. Now consider the tortoise and the eagle. The tortoise is a ground-living creature. It is impossible to live near to the ground without being under it. Its horizons are a few inches away, It has about as good of a turn of speed as you need to hunt down a lettuce. It has survived while the rest of the evolution flowed past it for being, on the whole, no threat to anyone, and too much trouble to eat. And then there is the eagle, the creature of the air and high places, where the horizons go all the way to the edge of the world, eyesight keen enough to spot the rustle of some small and squeaky creature half a mile away. All power, all control, lightning death on wings, talons and claws, enough to make a meal of anything smaller than it, and at least take a hurried snack out of anything bigger. And yet, the eagle will sit for hours on a crag and survey the kingdoms of the world until it spots a distant moment and a distant movement, and then it will focus on a small shell wobbling among the bushes down there on the desert. And it will leap. And a minute later, the tortoise finds the world dropping away from it, and it sees the world for the first time, no longer 1 inch from the ground, but 500 feet above it, and thinks, what a great friend I have in the eagle. And then the eagle lets go. And almost small, always, the tortoise plunges to its death. Everyone knows why the tortoise does this. Gravity is a habit that's hard to shake off. No one knows why the eagle does this. There's good eating on the tortoise, but considering the effort involved, there's much better eating practically anything else. It's simply a delight of eagles to torment tortoises. But of course, what eagle does not realize that it's participating in a very crude form of natural selection? One day, a tortoise will learn how to fly. The story takes place in a desert land, shades of umber and orange. When it begins, the end's more problematical, but at least one of the beginnings took place above the snow line, thousands of miles away, in mountains up around the hub. One recurrent philosophical question is, does the falling tree in the forest make a sound when there is no one to hear? Which says something about the nature of philosophers, because there's always something in a forest. It may only be a badger, wondering what crackling noise was, or a squirrel, a bit puzzled by all the scenery going upwards, but someone, at the very least, if it was deep enough for the forest, millions of small gods would have heard it. Things just happen, one after another. They don't care who knows. But history, history is different. History has to be observed. Otherwise, it's not history. Just, well, things happening one after another. And of course, it has to be controlled. Otherwise, it might be turned into anything, because history, contrary to popular theories, is kings and dates and battles. And these things have to happen at the right time. This is difficult. It is a chaotic universe. There are too many things to go wrong. It's too easy for a general's horse to lose a shoe at the wrong time, or for someone to mishear an order, or for the carrier of the vital message to be waylaid by some men with sticks and cash flow problem. There are wild stories, parasitic growths on the tree of history trying to bend their way. So history has its caretakers. They live, well, in the nature of things. They live wherever they are sent, but their spiritual home is hidden valley in the high ram tops of the Discworld, where the books of history are kept. These aren't books in which events of the past are pinned like so many butterflies to cork. These are books from the history is derived. There are more than 20,000 of them Each one is 10 feet high, bound in lead, and letters are so small that they have to be read with a magnifying glass. But when people say it's written, it is written here. There are a few metaphors around the people think. Every month, the abbot and the two senior monks go into the caves where the books are kept. It used to be a duty of the abbot alone, but two other reliable monks were included after the unfortunate case of the 59th abbot who made $1 million in a small bets before his fellow monks caught up with him. Besides, it's dangerous to go alone. The sheer concentratedness of history, sleeting past soundlessness out into the world, can be overwhelming. Time is a drug. Too much of it and it kills you. The 493rd abbot folded his wrinkled hands and addressed Liu Su, one of the most senior monks. The clear air, troubled life of the secret valley was such that of all the monks were senior. Besides, when you work with time every day, some of it tends to rub off.
The place is Omna,
the abbot said,
on the Clutching coast.
I remember. Lucy. Young fellow, Ossery, wasn't there?
Things must be carefully observed,
said the abbot.
These are pressures, free will, predestination, the power of symbols, turning points. You know all about this.
Hasn't been to Amara for, must be 700 years, said Lucy. Dry place. Shouldn't be the ton of good soil in the whole country either.
Off you go, then, said the abbot. I shall take my mountains,
said Lucy. The climate will be good for them. And he also took his broom and sleeping mat. The history monks didn't go in for possessions. They found things wear out in a century or two. It took him 4 years to get to Omnia. He had to watch a couple of battles and assassination on the way. Otherwise, there would have been just random events. It was the year of Notional Serpent, or 200 years after the declaration of the prophet Abes, which meant that the time for the 8th prophet was imminent. That was the reliable thing about the church of the great god Om. It had very punctual prophets. You could set your calendar by them, if you had one big enough, and generally is the case around the time of a prophet is expected, the church has redoubled its efforts to be holy. This is very much like the bustle you get in a large concern when auditors are expected, but tended towards taking people suspected of being less holy and putting them to death in 100 ingenious ways. This is considered a reliable barometer of the state of one's piety in most of the popular religions. There's a tendency to declare that there is more backsliding around than other national toboggan championships, but that heresy must be torn out root and branch, and even arm and leg and eye and tongue. And it's time to wipe out the clean slate. Blood is generally considered very efficient for this purpose. And it came to pass that the time of the great god Om spake unto Brutha, the chosen one. Psst! Brutha paused in the mid-hoe, stared down on the temple garden. Pardon? He said. It was a fine day in the early lesser spring. The prayer mills spun merrily in the breeze off the mountains. The bees loafed around in the bean blossoms, but buzzed fast in order to give the impression of hard work. High above, a lone eagle circled. Brutha shrugged and got back to the melons. Yea, the god Om spake unto Brutha, said the chosen one. Psst. Brutha hesitated. Someone had definitely spoken to him from the air. Perhaps it was a demon. Novice Master Brother Nuran was hot on the subject of demons, impure thoughts, and demons. One led to the other. Brutha was uncomfortably aware that he was probably overdue a demon. The thing was to resolve the repeat of the 9 fundamental aphorisms. Once more the great god Om spake unto Brutha, the chosen one. Are you deaf, boy? The hoe thudded on the baking soil. Brutha spun around. There were the bees, the eagle, and at the far end of the garden, old brother Lucy, dreamily forking over the dung heap. The prayer mills whirled reassuringly along the walls. He made the sign which the prophet Ishlikel had cast out the spirits. Get thee behind me, demon, he muttered. I am behind you. Brutha turned again, slowly. The garden was still empty. He fled. Many stories start long before they begin, and Brutha's stories has origins thousands of years before his birth. There are billions of gods in the world. They are swarm as thick as a herring roe. Most of them are too small to see, never get worshipped, at least by anything bigger than a bacteria, who never say their prayers and don't demand much things in the ways of miracles. They are small gods, the spirits of places where 2 ant trails cross, the gods of microclimates down between the grassroots, and most of them stay that way because what they lack is belief. A handful, though, go on to greater things. Anything that may trigger it, a shepherd seeking a lost lamb, finds it among its briars and takes a minute or two to build a small cairn of stones in general thanks to whoever spirits or whatever spirits might be the place, or a peculiarly shaped tree becomes associated with a cure for disease. One or someone carves a spiral arm on an isolated stone, because what gods need is belief, and what humans want is gods. Often it stops there, but sometimes it goes further. More rocks are added, more stones are raised, a temple is built on the site where the tree once stood. The god grows in strength, the belief of its worshippers raising it upwards like 1,000 tons of rocket fuel. For very few, the sky is the limit, and sometimes not even that. Brother Nimrod was wrestling with the impure thoughts of privacy in his severe cell when he heard a fervent voice notivates dormitory. The Brutha boy was flat on his face in front of a statue of Om, and his manifestation as a thunderbolt, shaking and gabbling fragments of prayer. There was something creepy about that boy, Newman thought. It was the way he looked at you when you were talking, as if he was listening. He wandered out and prodded the prone youth with the end of his cane. Get up, boy. What do you think you're doing in the dormitory in the middle of the day, Brutha managed to spin around while still flat on the floor and grasped the priest's ankle. Voice! Voice! It spoke to me, he wailed. Nimrod breathed out. This was familiar ground. Voices were right up Nimrod's cloister. He heard them all the time. Get up, boy, he said slightly more kindly. Brutha got to his feet. It was Nimrod, had completed before, too, old to the proper novice, about 10 years too old. Give me a boy up to the age of 7, Nimrod had always said, but Brutha was going to die a novice. When they made the rules, they had never allowed for anything like Brutha. His big, red, honest face stared up at the novice master. "Sit down on your bed, Brutha," said Nimrod. Brutha obeyed immediately. Brutha did not know the meaning of the word disobedience. It was only one of the large number of words he didn't know the meaning of. Nimrod sat beside him. "Now, Brutha," he said, "you know what happens to people that tell falsehoods, don't you?" Brutha nodded, blushing. "Very well. Now tell me about these voices." Brutha twisted the hem of his robe. It was more like one voice, master," he said. Like one voice, Brother Nimrod. And what did this voice say? Brutha hesitated. He came to think about it. The voice hadn't said anything very much. It was just spoken. It was, in any case, hard to talk to Brother Nimrod, who had a nervous habit of squinting at the speaker's lips and repeating the last few words they said practically as they said them. He also touched things all the time. Walls, furniture, people, as if he was afraid the universe would disappear if he didn't keep hold of it. And he had so many nervous tics that they had a cue. Brother Nimrod was perfectly normal for someone who had survived the Citadel for 50 years. "Well," Brutha began. Brother Nimrod held up a skinny hand. Brutha could see the pale blue veins in it. "I am sure you know that there are two kinds of voices that you are heard by the spiritual," said the master of novices. One eyebrow began to twitch. "Yes, master. Brother Murdoch told us about that," said Brutha meekly. "Told us that? Yes, sometimes, as he is in his infinite wisdom sees fit, the God speaks to the chosen one, and he becomes a great prophet," said Nimrod. "Now I'm sure you wouldn't presume to consider yourself one of them, No, master." "Master. But there are other voices," said Brother Nimrod, and now his voice had a slight tremolo. "Beguiling and wheedling and persuasive voice, yes? Voices that are always wanting to catch us off guard." Brutha relaxed. This was more familiar ground. All the novices knew about those kinds of voices, except that usually they talked about fairly straightforward things, like pleasures of the nighttime, manipulation of the general desirability of girls, which showed that they were novices when it came to the voices. Brother Nimrod got the kind of voices that were, by comparison, for full orator. Some of the bolder novices liked to get Brother Nimrod talking about the subject of voices. He was an education, they said, especially the little bits of white spit appeared in the corners of his mouth. Brutha listened. Brother Nimrod was novice master, but he wasn't the novice master. He was only a master of the group that included Brutha. There were others, possibly someone at the Citadel who knew how many there were. There was someone somewhere whose job it was to know everything. The Citadel occupied the heart of the city of Qom, in the lands between the deserts of Klatch and the plains jungles of Hadouan land. It extended for miles. Its temples, churches, schools, dormitories, gardens, and towers growing into and around one another in a way that suggested millions of termites all trying to build their mounds at the same time. When the sun rose in reflection of the doors of the central temple blazed like fire, they were bronze and 100 feet tall. On them, in letters of gold set in lead, were commandments. There were 512 so far, and doubtless the next prophet would add his share. The sun's reflected glow shone down and across the tens of thousands of strong faith who labored below for the greater glory of the great God Om. Probably no one did know how many of them there were. Some things have a way of going critical. Certainly, there was only one Sedo Biash, the superior I am. That was certain, and 6 archpriests and 30 lesser I ams, and hundreds of bishops, deacons, subdeacons, priests, the novices like rats in a grain store, and craftsmen and bull breeders and torturers and vesical virgins. No matter what your skills, there was a place for you in the citadel. And if your skill lay in asking the wrong kinds of questions or losing the righteous kinds of wars, the place might just be for the furnaces of purity or the quisitions, pits of justice. A place for everyone, and everyone in their place. The sun beat down on the temple garden. The great god Om tried to stay in the shade of a melon vine. He was probably safe here inside these walls and the prayer towers all around, but you couldn't be too careful. He had been lucky once, but it was asking too much to be lucky again. The trouble with being a god is that you've got no one to pray to. He crawled forward purposely towards the old man shoveling muck until, after much exertion, he judged himself to be within earshot. He spake thusly, "Hey, you!" There was no answer. There's not even any suggestion that anything had been heard. Om lost his temper and turned to Luciu, into lowly worm into the deepest cesspit of hell, and then got even angry when the old man went on a peaceful shoveling. "The devils of infinity, fill your living bones with sulfur," he screamed. This did not even make a great deal of difference. "Deaf old bugger," muttered the great god Om. But perhaps there was someone who did know all that there was to be known about the citadel. There's always someone who collects knowledge, not because of love of the stuff, but the same way that a magpie collects glitter or caddisfly collects little bits of twigs and rocks. There's always been someone who has to do all the things that need to be done, but which people would rather not do or even acknowledge existed. The third thing that people noticed about Vorbis was his height. He was well over 6 feet, but stick thin, like normal proportional person, modeled in clay by a child and then rolled out around. The second thing that people noticed about Vorbis is his eye. His ancestor had come from one of the deep desert tribes. He had evolved the peculiar trait of having dark eyes. Not just dark of pupil, but almost black of eyeball. It made it hard to tell where he was looking at, and if he had sunglasses on under his skin. But the first thing that they noticed was his skull. Deacon Vorbis was bald by design. Most of the church's ministers, as soon as they were ordained, cultivated long hair and beards that you could lose a goat in. But Vorbis shaved all over. He gleamed, and his lack of hair seemed to add to his power. He didn't menace. He never threatened. He just gave everyone the feeling that his personal space radiated several meters from his body, and that anyone approaching Vorbis was intruding on something important. Superior's 50 years his senior felt apologetic about interrupting what it was that he was thinking about. It was almost impossible to know what he was thinking about, and no one ever asked. The most obvious reason for this was Vorbis was head of the Quisition, whose job it was to do all those things that needed to be done and which other people would rather not do. You do not ask people like that what they are thinking about in case they turn around very slowly and say, "You." The highest post that it could be held in the Inquisition was that of deacon, a rule instituted hundreds of years ago to prevent this branch of the church becoming too big for its boots. But with mind and like his, everyone said that he could easily be archpriest by now, or even I am. Vorbis didn't worry about that kind of trivia. Vorbis knew his destiny. Hadn't God himself told him? There said Nimrod, patting through Bertha on the shelter. I am sure you will see things clearer now. Bertha felt specific reply was expected. Yes, master, he said. I am sure I shall. Shall? It is your holy duty to resist the voices at all times, Nimrod, still patting. Yes, master, I will do, especially if they tell me to do any things you mentioned. Mentioned? Good. Good. And if you hear them again, what will you do? Come and tell you, said Bertha dutifully. Tell you? Good. Good. That's what I like to hear, said Nimrod. That's what I tell my boys. Remember, I'm always here to deal with any little problems that's bothering you. Yes, master. Shall I go back to the garden now? Now I think so. There's a little subnote here. Which is the one-size-fits-all tighten the screws variety? And so, and no more. Voices, do you hear? Nimrod waved a finger at his non-pat hand, a cheek puckered. Yes, master. What were you doing in the garden? Hoeing the melons, master. Bertha. Melons? Ah, melons, Nimrod said. Melons? Melons? Well, that goes some way towards explaining things, of course. An eyelid flicked madly. It wasn't just the great God that spoke to Vorbis. In the confines of his head, everyone spoke to an inquisitor. Sooner or later, it was just a matter of stamina. Vorbis didn't often go down to watch the Inquisitions or at work these days. Inquisitors didn't have to. He sent down instructions. He received reports, but special circumstances merited his special attention. It has to be said, there's little to do and laugh at the cellar of the Inquisition. Not if you had a normal sense of humor. There were no jolly little signs saying, you don't have to be pitiless sadistic to work here, but it helps. But there are things to suggest thinking man at that creator of mankind had been very oblique sense of fun indeed to breed in his heart a rage to storm the gates of heaven. The mugs, for example, the inquisitors stopped at work twice a day for coffee. Their mugs, which were man-made, had brought from home, were grouped around the kettle on the hearth in the central furnace, which incidentally heated the irons and knives. They had legends on them like, present from the Holy Grotto of Ossuary, or to the world's greatest daddy. Most of them were chipped, and no two of them were the same. And there were postcards on the wall. It was traditional that an inquisitor, when on holiday, he'd send back a crudely colored woodcut of the local view with some suitably jolly and risque message on the back. And there was pinned up tearful letter from Inquisitor First Class Ishmael. Pop, qualm, thanking all the lads for collecting no fewer than 78 audibles for his retirement present, and the lovely bunch of flowers for Mrs. Qualm, indicating that he'd always remember his days in number 3 pit, and it was looking forward to coming in and helping out at any time they were short-handed. And it all meant this. There are handily excesses in the most crazed psychopath that cannot easily be duplicated by normal, kindly family man who just comes to work every day and has his job to do. Vorbis loved knowing that. A man who knew that knew everything he needed to know about people. Currently, he was sitting alongside the bench on which lay what was still, technically, and trembling body of Brother Sasho, formerly his secretary. He looked up at the duty inquisitor, who nodded. Vorbis leaned over. Chain's secretary. What were their names? He repeated. Oh, no. I know you gave them copies of the correspondence, Sasho. They are treacherous heretics who will spend eternity in hells. Will you join them? Don't know names. I trusted you, Sasho. You spied on me. You betrayed the church. Truth is cease for pain. Sasho, tell me. Truth. Vorbis sighed, and then he saw one of Sasha's fingers curling and uncurling from under the manacles, beckoning. Yes? He leaned closer to the body. Sasha opened his remaining eye. Truth. Yes? The turtle moose. Vorbis sat back, his expression unchanged. His expression seldom changed unless he wanted it to. The inquisitor watched him with terror. I see, said Vorbis. He stood up and nodded at the inquisitor. How long has it been down here? 2 days, Lord. And can you keep him alive for perhaps 2 days more, Lord? Do so. Do so. It is, after all, said Vorbis, our duty to preserve life for as long as possible, is it not? The inquisitor gave him a nervous smile, and the presence of a spirit whose the merest word could see him manacled on the bench. Yes, my lord. Heresy lies everywhere, Vorbis sighed. And now I shall have to find another secretary. It's too vexing. After 20 minutes, Brutha relaxed. The siren voices of sensual evil seemed to have gone away. He got on with Melons. He felt capable of understanding Melons. Melons seemed a lot more comprehensible than most things. Hey, you! Brutha straightened up. I do not hear you, O foul succubus, he said. Oh, yes, you do, boy. Now, what I want you to do is... I've got fingers in my ears. Suits you. Suits you. Makes you look like a vase. Now, I'm humming a tune. I'm humming a tune. I'm humming a tune. Brother Pratchett, the master of music, had described Brutha's voice as putting him in mind of a disappointed vulture arriving too late at the dead donkey. Choral singing was compulsory for novices, but After much petitioning by Brother Peratel, a special dispensation had been made for Brutha. The sight of a big round face screwed up in the effort to so please was bad enough, but it was worse for listening to his voice, which certainly powerful and full of intent and conviction, swing backward and forward across the tune without ever quite hitting it. He got extra melons instead. Up in the prayer towers, a flock of crows took off in a hurry. After a full chorus of "He trampled the unrighteous with hooves of hot irons," Brutha unplugged his ears and risked a quick listen. Apart from the distant protests from the crows, there was silence. It worked. Put your trust in the God, they said, and he will always had, as far back as he could remember. He picked up the hoe and turned back in relief to the vines. The hoe's blade was about to hit the ground when Brutha saw the tortoise. It was small and basically yellow, covered with dust. Its shell was badly chipped. It had one beady eye, and the other had fallen to one of the thousands of dangers which attend slow-moving creature which lives in the inch of the ground. He looked around. The gardens were inside the temple complex and surrounded by high walls. "How did you get in here, little creature?" he said. "Did you fly?" The tortoise stared monopolically at him. Brutha felt a bit homesick. There had been plenty of tortoises in the sandy hills back home. "I could give you some lettuce, but I don't think tortoises are allowed in the gardens. Aren't you vermin?" The tortoise continued to stare. Practically nothing can stare like a tortoise. Brutha felt obliged to do something. "There's grapes," he said. "Probably it's not sinful to give you one grape. How would you like a grape, little tortoise?" "How would you like to be the abomination in the nethermost pit of chaos?" said the tortoise. The crows who had fled to the outer walls took off again to rendering the way of the infidel is a nest of thorns. Brutha opened his eyes and took fingers out of his ears again. Tortoise said, "I'm still here." Brutha hesitated. It dawned on him very slowly that demons and succubi didn't turn up looking like small old tortoises. But they wouldn't be much point, even if Brother Numrod would have agreed that when it came to rampant eroticism, you could do a lot better than a one-eyed tortoise. "I didn't know tortoises could talk," he said. "They can't," said the tortoise. "Read my lips." Brutha looked closer. "You haven't got any lips," he said. "Nor proper vocal cords," agreed the tortoise. "I'm doing it straight into your head. Do you understand?" "Gosh!" "You do understand, don't you?" "No." The tortoise rolled its eye. "I should have known. Well, it doesn't matter. I don't have to waste time on gardeners. Go fetch the top man right now." "Top man?" said Brutha. He put his hand to his mouth. "You don't mean Brother Nomrod?" "Who's he?" said the tortoise. "The master of novices." "Oh, me," said the tortoise. "No," it went on in a sing-song imitation of Brutha's voice. "I don't mean the masters of novices. I mean the high priest, or whatever he calls himself. I suppose there is one." Brutha nodded blankly. "High priest, right," said the tortoise. "High priest, high priest." Brutha nodded again. He knew there was a high priest. It was just that, well, he could just about encompass heretical structure between his own self and Brother Ninad. He is unable to give serious consideration to any kind of link between Brutha and the novice of Cenobresh. He was theoretically aware that there was one, that there was a huge conical structure in the high priest at the top of Bruth, and Brutha was very firmly at the bottom. But he viewed it in the same way as an amoeba might view the chain of evolution all the way between itself, for example, and chartered accountant. It was missing links all the way to the top. I can't go asking the... Bertha hesitated, even though the thought of talking to the Cinnabranch actually frightened him into silence. I can't ask anyone to talk to the high Sidibiach to come right to the tortoise. Turn the mud and leech wither in fires of retribution, screamed the tortoise. There's no need to curse, Brutha said. The tortoise bounced up and down furiously. That wasn't a curse. That was an order. I am the great god Om. Brutha blinked. Then he said, No, you're not. I've seen the great god Om. He waved his hand, making the shape of the holy horns conscientiously. And he isn't tortoise-shaped. He comes as an eagle or a lion or a mighty bull. There's a statue in the great temple. He's 7 cubits high. He's got a bronze on it and everything. It's trampling infidels. You can't trample infidels when you're a tortoise. I mean, all you could do is give them meaningful looks. It's got great horns of real gold. When I used to live, there was a statue 1 cubit high in the next village that was a bull too. So that's how I know you're not the great god. Holy horns, Om. The tortoise subsided. How many talking tortoises have you met? It said sarcastically. I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, they might all talk. Bertha conscientiously demonstrating the very personal kind of logic that got him extra melons. They just might not say anything when I'm there. I am the great god Om, said the tortoise in a menacing and unavoidable low tone. And before very long you are going to be very unfortunate priest. Go get him. Novice, said Brutha. What? Novice, not priest. They won't let me get him. But I don't think Cinnabranch ever comes into the vegetable garden, says Brutha. I don't think that he even knows what a melon is. I'm not bothered by that, said the tortoise. Fetch him now, or there will be a shaking of the earth. The moon will be blood. Eggs and boils will afflict mankind. Diverse ills will befall. I really mean it, it added. I'll see what I can do, said Bertha, backing away. And I'm being very reasonable in circumstances, the tortoise shouted after him. You don't sing badly, mind you, it added in afterthought. I've heard worse, as Bertha grubbily robe disappeared and threw out the gateway. Puts me in a mind of that time there was an affliction of the plague of Pseudopolis, it said quietly as the footsteps faded. What a wailing and gnashing of teeth was there. All right, it sighed. Great days, great days. Many feel they are called to the priesthood, but what they really hear is the inner voice saying, It's indoor work. There's no heavy lifting. Do what you want to be a plowman like your Do you want to be a plowman like your father? Whereas Bertha didn't believe. He really believed that sort of thing was usually embarrassing when it happens in a God-fearing family, but all Bertha had was his grandmother, and she believed too. She believed like iron believes in metal. She was that kind of woman every priest dreads in the congregation, and one who knows all the chants, all the sermons. If Armenian church women were allowed to be in the temple only on sufferance, and they had to keep absolutely silent and work well covered up in their own section behind the pulpit in case the sight of one of the human race caused the male members of the congregation to hear voices not unakin to those that plagued Brother Nimrod through every sleeping and waking hour. The problem was that Bertha's grandmother had that kind of personality that can project itself through a lead sheet, and a bitter piety with the strength of a diamond-bit auger. If she'd been born a man, Omnizion would have found its eighth prophet rather earlier than expected. As it was, she organized the temple cleaning, statue polishing, stoning of suspected adulteresses, Rhodas with a terrible efficiency. But Bertha grew up in a sure and certain knowledge of the great god Alm. Bertha knew, growing up, knowing that in Alm's eyes were on him all the time, especially in places of piety, that demon assailed him on all sides, and they're only kept at bay by the strength of his belief and the weight of his grandmother's cane, which was kept behind the door on those rare occasions when it was not being used. He could recite every verse of all 7 books of the prophets and every single precept. He knew all the laws and songs, especially the laws. The Amarians were God-fearing people. They had a great deal to fear. Vorbus's room was upper citadel, which was unusual for a mere deacon. He had asked for it. He seldom had to do anything. Destiny was a way of marking his own. He got it visited by some of the most powerful men in the church's hierarchy. Not, of course, the 6 archpriests of the Terry Pratchett himself. They weren't that important. They were merely at the top. The people who really run the organization are usually found several levels down, where it's still plausible to get things done. People like to be friends with Vorbus, mainly because the aforesaid mental field which suggested to them the subtlest ways that they didn't want to be his enemy. 2 of them were sitting down on him now. They were General I.M. Friet, who, whatever the official records might suggest, was a man who ran most of the Divine Legion, the Bishop Druna, Secretary of the Congress IMs. People might not think much of the position of power, but then they'd never been minute secretary to a meeting of slightly deaf old men. Neither man was, in fact, there. They were not talking to Vorbus. It was one of those kinds of meetings. Lots of people did talk to Vorbus and went out of their way to have meetings with him. And some of the abbots were distant monasteries had recently been summoned to the citadel, traveling secretly for up to a week across tortuous terrain, just so they definitely wouldn't join the shadowy figures visiting Vorbus's room. The last of the few months, Vorbus had apparently had about as many visitors as the man on the Iron Mask. Nor were they talking, but if they had been there, and if they had been having a conversation, it would have gone like this. And now, Vorbus. The matter of Ifidel. Bishop Druna shrugged. Of no consequence, they say. No threat. The team looked at Vorbus. A man never raised his voice. It was very hard to tell what Vorbus was thinking, even after he told you. Really? Is this what you've come to? He said. No threat. No threat. After what they did to poor brother Murdoch? The insults to Ulm? This must not pass. What is the proposed to be done? No more fighting, said Friet. They might like madmen. No, they fight like madmen. We've lost too many already. They have strong gods, said Druna. They have better bows, said Friet. There's no god but Ohm, said Vorbus. What Ephebians believe is they worship are nothing but jinns and demons. If it can be called worship, have you seen this? He pushed forward the scroll of paper. What is it, Friet? Cautiously. A lie. A history that does not exist and never existed. The things. Warvis hesitated, trying to remember a word that had long since fallen into disuse, like the tales told to children who are too young. Words for people to say a play, said Friet. Warvis gazed, nailed him to the wall. You know of these things? When I traveled to Klatch once, Friet stuttered. He visibly pulled himself together. He had commanded 100,000 men in battle. He didn't deserve this. He found he didn't dare look at Vorbis' expression. They dance dances, he said limply, or on holy days. The women have bells on their and sing songs, and about the early days of the worlds when the gods, he faded. It was disgusting, he said. He clicked his knuckles, habit, whenever he was worried. This one has their gods in it, said Vorbis. Men in mass. Can you believe that? They have a god of wine, a drunken old man, and people said Ephebi is no threat. And this. He tossed another thick scroll on the table. This is far worse. For while they worship false gods in error, they err in their choice of gods, not in their worship, but this. Juna gave a cautious examination. I believe there are other copies, even in the citadel, said Vorbis. This one belonged to Sasho. I believe you recommended him to be in my service for it. He was always struck me as an intelligent and keen young man, said the general, but disloyal, said Vorbis. And now receiving his reward, it is only regretted that not been induced into give us the name of the fellow heretics. Friet fought against the sudden rush of relief. His eyes met those of Vorbis. Druna broke in silence. De Chalin Mobile? He said aloud. The turtle moves. What does it mean? Even telling you could put your soul at risk 1,000 years in hell, said Vorbis. His eyes had not left Friet, who was now staring fixedly at the wall. I think risk might be carefully taken, said Druna. Vorbis shrugged. The winner claims the world, travels through the void on the back of 4 huge elephants, he said. Druna's mouth dropped open. On the back, he said. It is claimed, said Vorbis, still watching Fred. What do they stand on? The writers say they stand on the shell of an enormous turtle, said Vorbis. Druna grinned nervously. And what does that stand on? He said. I see no point in speculating what it stands on, snapped Vorbis, since it does not exist. Of course. Druna quickly. It was only idle curiosity. Most curiosity is, said Vorbis. It leads to the mind to speculate ways. Yet, the man who wrote this walks around free in Ephebi now. Druna glanced at the scroll. He says here he went on a ship that sailed on an island to the edge. He looked over and... Lies, said Vorbis evenly. And it would make no difference, even if there were not lies. Truth lies within, not without. In the words of the great god as delivered through the chosen prophets, our eyes may deceive us, but our God never will. But, Vorbis looked at Friet. The general was sweating. Yes? He said, well, if Phoebe... A place where madmen have mad ideas. Everyone knows that. Maybe the wisest course is to leave them to stew in their folly. Robert shook his head. Unfortunately, and wild and unstable ideas have a disturbing tendency to move around and take hold. Fried had to admit this was true. He knew from experience that true and obvious ideas such as ineffable wisdom and judgment of the great god seemed to obscure so many people that you actually had to kill them before they saw the error of their ways, whereas dangerous and nebulous and wrong-headed notion often such had an attraction for some people that they knew would. He rubbed a scar thoughtfully high up in the mountains and throw rocks down onto you until you starve them out. They prefer to die than see sense. See sense. Fried had seen sense at an early age. He had seen sense not to die. What do you propose? He said. The council wants a parley with Ephebi, said Druna. You know, I had to organize a deputation to leave tomorrow. How many soldiers? Said Vorbus. A bodyguard only. We have been guaranteed safe passage after all, said Friet. We have been guaranteed safe passage? Said Vorbus. It sounded like a lengthy curse. And once inside, Fried wanted to say, I've spoken to the commander of the Ephebian garrison, and I think it was a man of honor, although, of course, he indeed is despicable infidel and lower than worms. But it was not the kind of thing he felt wise to say to Vorbus. He substituted, We shall be on our guard. Can we surprise them? Fried hesitated. We? He said. I shall lead the party, said Vorbus. There was a briefest exchange of glances between himself and the secretary. I would like to be away from the citadel for a while. A change of air. Besides, we should not let the Ephebians think that they merit the attentions of a superior member of the church. I was just musing to the possibilities. Should we be provoked? Fried's nervous click was a whip crack. We have given them our word, but there is no truth with unbelievers, said Vorbus. But there are practical considerations, said Fried, as sharply as he dared. The palace of Ephebi is a labyrinth, I know. There are traps. No one gets in without a guide. How does the guide get in, Vorbus? I assume guides himself, said the general. In experiences, there is always another way, said Vorbus. Into everything, there is always another way, which the god will show us in his own good time. We can be assured of that. Certainly matters would be easier if there was a lack of stability in Ephebi, said Druna. It does indeed harbor certain elements. And it will be the gateway to the whole turn-wise coast, said Vorbus. Well, the Jegel and the Tissot, said Vorbus. Druna tried to avoid seeing Friet's expression. It is our duty, said Vorbus. Our holy duty. We must not forget Brother Murdoch. He was unarmed and alone. Brutus' huge sandals flip-flopped obediently along the stone corridor toward Brother Nimrod's barren cell. He tried composing messages in his head. Master, there's a tortoise who says, Master, this tortoise wants... Master, guess what? I heard from this tortoise in the melons that... Brutha would never have dared to think himself as a prophet, but he had shrewd idea of the outcome of any interview that began in this way. Many of the people assumed that Brutha was an idiot. He looked like one. He was, from his round open face to his splay feet and knock ankles. He also had the habit of moving his lips while he was in thought deeply, as if he was rehearsing every sentence. And because that was what he was doing. Thinking was not something that came easily to Brutha. Most of the people think automatically, thoughts dancing through their brains like static electricity across the cloud. At least that's how it seemed to him, whereas he had to construct thoughts a bit at a time, like someone building a wall. A short lifetime of being laughed at for having a body like a barrel and feet like a grave. The impression that they were about to get set out in the opposite direction had given him a strong tendency to think very carefully anything he said. Brother Nimrod was prostrate on the floor in front of the statue of trampling the ungodly with his fingers in the air. The voices were troubling him again. Bertha coughed. He coughed again. Bertha Nimrod raised his head. Brother Nimrod, said Bertha. What? Brother Nimrod? What? Brother Nimrod unplugged his ears. Yes, he said testily. There's something you ought to see in the garden, Brother Nimrod. The master novices stand up. Bertha's face was a glowing picture of concern. What do you mean? Brother Nimrod said. In the garden, it's hard to explain. I found out where the voices were coming from, Brother Nimrod, and you did say to be sure to tell you. The priest gave Bertha a sharp look. But if there was ever a person without guile of any kind of subtlety, it was Bertha. Fear is strange soil. Mainly it grows obedience like corn, which grows in rows and makes a wedding easy. But sometimes it grows the potatoes of defiance, which flourish in underground. The citadel had a lot of underground. There are the pits and tunnels of Inquisition. There were the collars and sewers, forgotten rooms, dead ends, spaces behind ancient walls, even natural caves in the bedrock itself. This was such a cave. Smoke from the fire in the middle of the floor found its way through the crack of the roof, eventually into the maze of uncountable chimneys and light wells above. There were a dozen figures in the dancing, shading shadows. There were rough boots over nondescript clothes, crude things made of rags, nothing that couldn't easily be burned after a meeting that the wandering fingers of the Inquisition would find. Nothing incriminating. Something about the way most of them moved suggested the men were used to carrying weapons. Here and there, clues, a stance, a turn of a word. On one wall of the cave, there was a drawing. It was vaguely oval, 3 little extensions at the top. The middle one was slightly largest of the 3, and the 3 at the bottom. One in the middle of these, slightly longer and more pointed, a child drawing of the turtle. Of course he'll go to it, Phoebe, said the mask. He won't dare not to. He'd have to dam the river of the truth at its source. But we must bail out. We can then, said another man. We must kill Vorvis, not in Ephebi. When that happens, it must be happened here, so people will know. When we're strong enough, we will ever be strong enough. Its owner clicked its knuckles nervously. Even the peasants know that there's something wrong. You can't stop the truth. Damn the river of the truth. Then there are leaks at the great force. Didn't we find out about murder? Ha! Killed in Phoebe, Worbus said. One must go to Phoebe and save the master if he really exists. He exists. His name is on the book. Dido Acletus. The strange name. It means 2-fingered, you know. They must honor him in Ephebi. Bring him back here, if possible, and the book. One of the masks seemed to hesitate. His knuckles clicked again. But will people rally behind a book? People need more than a book. They're peasants. They can't read, but they can listen. Even so, they need to be shown. They need a symbol. We have one. Instinctively, every masked figure turned to look at the drawing on the wall, indistinct in the firelight, but graven on their minds. They were looking at the truth, which could often impress. The turtle moves! The turtle moves! The turtle moves! The leader nodded. And now, he said, we will all draw lots. Well, that was 34 pages. And I will start again at midsection of third. Well, actually, 2/3 down from page 34. I hope you enjoyed my reading. I made several mistakes, but there's no editor tonight. If you'd like to help edit, if you have some extra voice that you'd like to lend me, that would be great. I am Michael Tanner. I'm going to sign off for tonight. I hope that you had a great, great day. Thank you. As I said, you can see me and hear me in other parts. I work for Dice Media Group during the day, and this is my night job, or well, it's a hobby. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed it. This was Terry Pratchett's Small Gods, a novel of the Discworld, and a book that you should all get if you can. There we go. Yes. Anyway, everybody have a great night or a great morning or whatever. I hope that you have great dreams tomorrow night. See ya.